Development cost modifier in EU4. This is not development cost, although it does impact how expensive it is to develop a province. Let me explain. When you go to develop a province with your mana, the game calculates a default fee of 50 points, and then it changes that fee depending on any development cost you may have. So if you have a 30 development province on a farmland while the state is prospering, your cost is plus 99% for the base development, minus 5 for the farmland, and minus 10 for prosperity, so it comes to 84% more expensive, on top of the 50, so the game will charge you 92 points. What development cost modifier does is it decreases the base cost of development. So if you have minus 10 development cost modifier, you'll have to pay 50 minus 10%, so 45 base mana, which will then be increased by the same 84% to 83 mana points. This is a separate scaler to say minus 10% dev cost from infrastructure deals, which would get cancelled eventually by the existing increased development cost of the province. This description should be enough for 99% of the cases where you encounter it, but if you want a more in-depth explanation, feel free to stick around for the rest of the video. Okay, if you're still here, welcome. If you're feeling up to it, a like and a sub would be appreciated, but with the self-shooting out the way, let's continue. So, development cost modifier. Development cost on the surface itself is relatively simple. First, terrain has an impact. Building a city on some farmlands is cheaper than building up on a mountain. Furthermore, the larger the city, the more the development cost increases. There can be some other stuff, it's Paradox, they hand out development costs very generously, but we're not talking about development cost here. Instead, we're referring to development cost modifier, which is not the same as the modifier development cost. If you're paying attention in the first section of the video, you should be aware of how it works. Development cost modifier affects the base cost of development, and the development cost affects the cumulative modifier instead. As such, if it were possible to achieve a 100% development cost reduction, all development would be free, but outside of modding the game, you can't do that. So this naturally begs the question how far you can go with it. With only 3 things in the game giving it, outside of technology, and 2 of those things being mutually exclusive, the answer is both very far eventually, but really nowhere near far enough. So within the context of vanilla, since mods can add a 20% dev cost modifier and throw this entire video out the window, where can you encounter development cost modifier? And when you do, should you go for it? Well, it occurs in 3 places. When you're playing as a small country and you obtain the bureaucracy tier of reforms, you can select the centralized bureaucracy for minus 5% dev cost modifier. The issue is you need to own less than 15 or 25 or 35 or 50 same continent provinces depending on your age. Now this isn't strictly true. The scope there actually checks for the content of your capital. So if your capital is somewhere silly like Australia and then expand into Asia and run the minus 5% dev cost modifier privilege, you can still, well, run it and have it on 1,000 provinces. However, in most cases, most players tend to have more than 15 provinces by the time they hit this reform. A good chunk of starting countries that get played start with over 15 provinces. And once you exceed 15 provinces, the 5% dev cost modifier is gone and replaced with other stuff, which is a development cost modifier and hence for the purpose of this video may as well not exist. Another source of development cost modifier is the last reform of theocracies, containing 2.5% dev cost modifier reduction. We're going to be returning to it later. In the last place, the development cost modifier is available from the start of the game, but only for Korea. 5% dev cost modifier if they go inward focused from the 3 options they have. It should be also noted that expansion focus for Korea grants them a potentially painful plus 10 dev cost modifier, plus 10, and hence developing really should be avoided as Korea while you are looking outside. So those are the 3 places that development cost modifier can only be obtained in standard setup IMAN vanilla, in terms of, well, your country setup overall. For enjoyers of development cost modifier, you will however be happy to hear that you can get a total 30% more from technology, namely 10% from the text of 17, 23, and 27. An interesting to mention here, and this is something that's important and needs to be clarified, is in the technologies, it is referred to not as development cost modifier like it is in every single modifier that you've seen so far, but it's actually referred to something called development efficiency. This is the same thing. It's just, if development cost modifier comes from technology, it's called development efficiency. If development cost modifier comes from literally anywhere else, it's called development cost modifier. Why? I don't know. I think Paradox looked at the fact that there were 2 kinds of development cost and realized, no, let's make a 3rd kind of development cost, and let's have 2 of those kinds be the exact same thing, just to really mess with people for fun. Anyway, with that mini rant aside, you end up with those development cost modifier reductions anyway, with literally every single country you play, as long as you get to Tech 27. So should you be ever going for the other sources though? It scales very well multiplicatively. The more reduction you have a modifier, the stronger it becomes. Well, before we get into that, and before we start thinking about these ridiculous numbers that aren't achievable, I'm going to have to question the campaign you're doing. See, if you're playing single player to do a world conquest, or an achievement, or literally anything that isn't AFKing at your computer pressing the dev button, the answer to the question of should you go for dev cost modifier is no. Don't get me wrong, I play multiplayer, so sitting at my computer staring at the dev button is a large part of what I consider fun. But most campaigns don't involve development to any real degree. You gain development by conquest from the AI, and the few times you do develop is for an institution. This means that the source of development cost modifier you tend to see the most is the one at the end of the theocracy, government reforms, as most campaigns tend to not be Korea, and tend to make you expand past 15 provinces by the 16th century. But regardless of that point, let's assume we are going to be going for the development cost reduction. How useful is it going to be? Well, I'm going to be taking a look at a grassland 30 development province for this example. So a 99% development cost from the current development, nothing more, nothing less. How much development cost reduction do we normally have if we're doing this in multiplayer, or we are just staring at the province deving single player? Well, firstly, we are assuming vanilla. So in most cases, I'm going to be assuming at least 50% innovatorness for -5 all power cost, hence -5 dev cost. 2 expand infrastructure clicks for -30 dev cost. A uni for -20. A dev cost edict for -10. Prosperity for 10 more, well, -10 to be clear. And a loyal burghers estate with 60 influence for another further -10 reduction. Let's be clear, this is the stuff that you normally end up running when you are focusing on development within vanilla. Most of these things people are known, most of these things that I mentioned so far, people run by default. And when you combine this with having the Renaissance embraced, because again you've got unis, so you probably should have the Renaissance embraced by this point, you will hit a dev cost reduction of 80%. Furthermore, since we have unis embraced and you're deving a 30 dev province, I'm going to assume that it's quite late in the game, because usually at this point you'll only be deving 20 devs and deving things to 20. So the fact you're considering to dev a 30 dev province, again, is my assumption that's quite late. So I'm going to be assuming at least admin tech 23, but not 27. So then we're going to have 20% dev cost reduction from tech. This is going to be a disproportional buff to the dev cost reduction from the theocracy last reform. Furthermore, another thing to bear in mind is I'm already rigging it for the government reform. This is a conservative list. By this point in the game, innovativeness tends to be a bit higher than 50%, and that's an understatement to usually have capped out. You'd also most likely have a religion that gives you either 5% or 10% dev cost reduction on top of it, and you probably have a -10% dev cost from a world port in the state, and maybe even some development costs from the HRE reforms, or even running costs in the province. Maybe you're even running parliament, so you can assign a seat for another 10% reduction. You get the point, there's a lot of sources of dev costs in this game, and I'm only mentioning the ones that are available to most countries. So the 80% is, again, a conservative estimate. Well, to get back to the math, you'll be paying 48 mana per click without the final theocracy reform, and 46 mana with the theocracy reform that gives you 2.5% development cost modifier. So the answer remains no, that's only really going to matter when you are competing for dev clicks with other players. 2.5% is a very sad amount, especially when the other offerings include 2.5% admin efficiency or 30% province war score cost against other religions. It's still strong for sure when you're deving a lot of things, and it is going to add up and save you mana in the long run, don't get me wrong, people are doing 300 dev clicks a session. But I doubt it's going to win you the game. But say you want to enjoy dev cost modifier without making a mod that gives it to you or installing one that gives it to you. What is your best option? Well, it's time to mention something that has always been in my disclaimers, custom nations. See, Paradox in their infinite wisdom decided to add up to -20 dev cost modifier as a custom nation's ideas. So go ahead and grab that, and since we're playing a custom nation anyway, go Korean Hermit Kingdom and stay below 50 provinces, so expand to 49, since you'll be getting admin tech 27 for this build, and so that kind of requires being in the last stage. And to add insult to injury to the rest of the idea group, add -20 dev cost and or power cost as well, just to really help the whole development spiel. So let's take a look at our old estimate of 80% dev cost reduction, 20% dev efficiency. For a power comparison, we're going to have to reevaluate that slightly, 80% dev cost, about 30% dev efficiency since we're going to admin tech 27. So with that all said and done, we're looking at 42 dev cost per click. And we're going to be taking that, and instead we're going to be hitting a 110% dev cost reduction, since we're grabbing 20% dev cost from custom nation ideas too, as well as 10% all power costs. And an insane overall -60% overall dev cost modifier, to arrive at a very nice cost of 19 dev per click, on a 30 dev province. The best part of this is that development cost rises from the development of the province itself. The base cost will always remain at 20, so the percentage increase from the buff will be significantly smaller than those without it. So if that sounds like a campaign you want to try, go for it. I'd recommend a custom nation starting either in the Italy or England regions, so that your 49 provinces become enough for you to gain majority control of your end node. I hope you learned something new today, and if you didn't, I hope you at least enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.